In this lesson, we'll look at some typical topology type scenarios where we may need to redraw some of the geometry on our models. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So we're just going to use this head bust as an example. And so you can see we've got a number of quads here for the most part. And you can see that the topology is actually flowing in a number of different directions. We've got geometry flowing around this way and around here, and all flowing around in different directions. So with that, you're going to get some issues with trying to either maintain your quad geometry and also avoid something called poles. So there are a couple of issues to think about. For instance, if we look at the back of the head, we can see that we've got a lot of resolution coming over here across the top of the head. And now there are a few things to think about. Now, a lot of times we'll want to eliminate this resolution because the head, we're not going to have a lot of detail up here, so a lot of this resolution is really unnecessary. So in that case, we may want to cut off some of these edges. Okay, so use this kind of intersection here as an example. Let's say that we want to kind of take all of these edges and narrow them down into one particular edge. Well, there's a way that we can do that. It's not particularly ideal in areas where you're going to have deformation, so it's something to kind of be careful with doing this. But if you go in and grab your split polygon tool, this is going to be a really important tool when manually redrawing topology and geometry. So let's say that we have these three edges coming down here, flowing in this direction, but we only have one edge here. Now, we could continue these edges down. So right now we've got n-gons here and here. So we want to eliminate those. So we could continue this down, split these in half, continue this all the way down here, continue this line all the way down here, and just continue that loop all the way around. But in many cases, we're going to want to cut those loops off. So in this case, we can come in and grab the two outer edges, bring those into this point and back, okay, which gives us quad here and here, and then two triangles, okay. And then if you delete that center edge, that gives you another quad. You can kind of space that out. Now, this is definitely not ideal, okay, especially at this position on the neck. So it's really something to be careful with. But you can see now that the geometry basically flows in this direction and then flows up to the head, and this direction flows up to the head. Sometimes these are called kites. I've heard them called different things. So just something to really be careful of when you're trying to do this. A lot of times you'll have very similar looking things on something like the hand, where you've got a lot of resolution coming in from the fingers, coming into the base of the hand where you don't need as much resolution. So just something to be aware of, because you can see that we don't now have this nice line across here to deform, and we also have a pole that has been created right here. And a pole just means that we've got more than four edges coming into a single point. So you can see here where we've just got the quads coming. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 edges meeting at this single point. Okay. Now here we've got 5. Okay, which is not too bad. It's really going to be hard to avoid having poles when you're working with trying to create quads. So you can see we've got one here, and we've got one up there. So those are going to be hard to avoid because you've got different sorts of edge loops coming around, meeting up, and you're trying to maintain that quad geometry. You're going to have some of those. You just want to put them in areas that are not going to deform too much, that are going to be sort of out of sight. Okay, so let's look at getting rid of some of the poles. Now, some of the poles with 5 edges coming in are going to be hard to avoid. But if you've got something that maybe has 6, for instance, down here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 coming into this single point. We may want to try to modify that topology. So let's go ahead and use our split polygon tool, and we'll think about this a little bit. We want to take some of these edges away from this single point. So we could start here, bring these down. In many cases, this is going to require that we move our geometry and flow it down the model. So we could take this down here, okay, delete that edge. Let's do the same thing over here. Okay, kind of bring that down. And we'll just stop it here for sake of expedience. And now we've eliminated the pole, but we've now got 2 n-gons right here. Okay, so we need to sort of fix those. One of the ways that we can do that is simply to draw across here. Okay, so now we don't have a pole here or here, but we do have a pole on either side. But in this case, the pole only has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 edges coming into it. So we've taken one pole with 6 edges and turned it into a pole on either side with 5 edges. Okay, you could continue to try to redraw some of this to eliminate those poles as you see fit. We also need to continue this geometry down the neck as well, so we don't want to leave that. Okay, another thing to be concerned about when you create a kite like this, especially in the middle, you've eliminated the ability to work symmetrically as far as having that line go down the center, okay, because you've eliminated that center line. So these are something to be careful with, but those are a couple of ways that we can start to redraw some of the topology and geometry that we have. Just remember, it's really important to remember that you're not stuck with the topology that we created. It's going to take a little while to get used to building for different shapes, and you'll always have the ability to go in and change things up. Another thing to think about, let's go ahead and I'm just going to create a polygon cylinder, and let's create a polygon sphere as well. And I'm just going to set this down to 12 so we can see this a little bit better. And on the cylinder, I'll do the same thing. Okay. Now, you can see that we have poles on the sphere and on the cylinder as well. So we've got all of these edges flowing into that single point. Now, if we're going to be smoothing this out, let me go ahead and add a few edge loops in here. Let's say we want this sort of sharpened cylinder here, but we want to smooth it out. So I'm going to insert some edge loops here. Okay, and now we want to go ahead and kind of smooth this out. We can see that a lot of this geometry, all of this geometry basically is flowing into this single point, which can cause problems. So one of the ways that we can sort of convert this into a quad face is just to go in on the cylinder and take some of these edges and just get rid of those. So I'm going to select basically every other edge, and depending on the resolution of your cylinder, you may not be able to do this because of the number of divisions, but in this case we've got an even number, and we can go ahead and select every other edge and eliminate those edges, and now we're left with quads at the top of the cylinder. If we go ahead and select those, we can just kind of extrude those in, create another edge there. Okay, and now we smooth that. We get the same shape, but we're working with quads instead of all of those triangles. Now again, this is something that you may not need to do at all, but depending on your pipeline, it may be a good little tip to keep into account when you're working with a pole like this. Now the same thing over here on this sphere. We have the sphere shape, and we want to maintain the sphere shape, but we don't necessarily want all of this geometry flowing directly into this point. Okay, if we're maybe going to be sculpting this, we don't want to have, because if you sculpt it and you start subdividing this again and again and again, then the pole is never going to go away. It's just going to get worse because all that geometry is still flowing in the same point. So what we want to do is go ahead, and I'm just going to leave the center line right here. Okay, I'm going to delete all of these lines, and let's just leave that sort of cross in the middle there. Okay, so rather than as we did before, deleting every other face, this time we can go ahead, or every other edge rather, this time we can go ahead and use a split polygon tool, and depending on what we want to do, we can grab this one, kind of move it across here. Okay, let's do the same thing down here. Move it across the sphere. Okay, and now you can see we've got quad, quad, and then quads over here. And when we smooth it, that gives us, eliminates the pole and lets us keep our shape that we've got there. So you can see that may need to smooth it out a little bit because we've got these points sort of sticking up here. Okay, and if your sphere's higher resolution, it's going to work a little bit better, but that's one way of eliminating this pole that we have here on the ends. All right, so those are just a few things to kind of be aware of when you're working with geometry. You've got the type of faces that you're working with, and you can always kind of change those up and redraw those. Triangles, quads, n-gons, and then you've also got the type of vertex that you're working with, whether it's a pole or not. Ideally, a lot of times you want to have this just 4 edges coming into this single point. When you start to get more than 4 edges coming into points, you can start to get some issues. So just as a kind of a good modeling practice, it's usually good to try to eliminate those poles as much as possible. So those are just some things to keep in mind. Just remember that the topology is not set. You can always change it up, redraw it. You don't have to be happy with what you're ending up with. You can go ahead and change that to your liking. So the next thing that we're going to talk about, something that's been asked a lot, and it has to do with adding circular type cutouts and resolution to things that may be flat, square, things like that. So we're going to look at a few ways that we can achieve that type of a look in the next lesson.